friends, dear guests, dear public on Zoom, I am happy to introduce the second lecture of the seasons of History in the Edge, Zgodovina Špici lectures. And I'm introducing Marta Chmielewska, let's hope I pronounced okay, with her and her lecture, Flexible Labor, Intimate Objects, Undergarment Production in Socialist and Post-Socialist Small Town Poland, 1949-2023. Marta Chmielewska is currently a fourth-year PhD researcher at the History Department at the European University Institute in Florence, working on a thesis on underwear production in socialist and post-socialist small-town Poland, entitled The History of Capitalism from Below, Undergarment Production in Socialist and Post-Socialist Small-Town Poland, 1949-2023. Supervised by Professor Głown, her work explores how Central and Eastern Europe's transition from Eastern Bloc socialist states to a liberal democratic member of the EU was experienced at a local level. In her work, she examines the history of the undergarment industry in small towns in central Poland since 1949. She's particularly interested in the corsetry workers' cooperative, I hope I said correctly, in Głown, from its establishment in 1949 until the present day, as the region remains a center for small businesses producing underwear. Her aim is to understand how the introduction of capitalism to Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 and 1991, 90s globalization, and EU enlargement in 2004 have shaped the organization of labor, gender practices, and family life. While her work focuses on small-town Poland, she aims to treat it as a case study that presents historical transitions at local and national levels, and also more broadly at the level of Eastern Bloc, region, and international world order. She is also interested in global socialist literature, queer studies, and contemporary social theories. And she's a part of queer and feminist working group at European University Institute in Florence. Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I speak here, or yeah, if you.
The technical team is okay?
Yeah.
Everything okay?
All right. All right. Okay.
It's only for recording.
I see. Perfect. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for this kind introduction. I've been here only for a few days, but I honestly feel so welcome. Felt so welcomed here as visiting fellow, and I'm really excited to speak with you about my PhD topic. This is fourth year, so maybe I should be a bit more advanced by now. But
that's what we all say all the time.
That's what it is. I'm very eager to hear your criticism, your feedback, and I would also love to hear more about your impressions, as I think it's always very valuable to speak to people who also work on the region, but not necessarily on the same country, because then it's really exciting to hear about the differences and similarities that maybe I would not come up with. Okay. So with this introduction, I just want to put my timer, because I've never actually spoke for that long. It's a very interesting format. And I'm going to start. And I want to start with an anecdote that kind of sets my research in like a wider context and kind of shows what I'm trying to achieve. So in January 2022, Central Textile Museum in Łódź opened its new permanent exhibition on the 20th century of history of textile production, and it's entitled City Fashion and Machine. And it's one of the first major exhibitions of the social history that is really concerned with labor and the whatever we call the change from the late 80s to the early 90s in the post-socialist region. Łódź is the third biggest city in the country. It's located in central Poland, and it developed around the textile industry in the beginning of 19th century, and it's often compared to Manchester. So it's like a Polish Manchester, because it also developed very quickly. Its population grew just in 1 century 3 times, and it was really centered around this female workers that were producing the textiles. And this exhibition is very fascinating. It gathers oral history interviews, historical objects. It has amazing press and archives research, photographs, and a lot of videos that kind of show this lively factory workers experience. And it's also from the perspective of the city, so urban studies. And it also touches on the history of the end of the 20th century, so the 1990s post-socialist garment production. And it has 3 floors. It presents this chronological timeline when it starts from this industrialization of the 19th century, end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the war, the state socialism era. And I feel like this switch between the state socialist era and the post-socialist era is very interesting. And it's also kind of not well industrialized yet. So on the left, yes, we see the this post-socialist stalls of the bazaars, which kind of became so emblematic for the memory of the 1990s, when the retail sector of the socialist states collapsed, and it was replaced by this open-air bazaars that were very popular and that were selling a lot of things. And really, they defined the changes in production trend and consumption, especially of the garment industry of that decade. And of course, who produced, like the produce there were very often produced by the small entrepreneurs. That became the dominant form of production in the garment industry, but also overall in the economy in the 1990s. So it's estimated that small business in the clothing industry grew from less than 100 before the transition in 1989 to almost 50,000 in 1992. But of course, it's actually very hard to estimate that, since a lot of them were not acting formally, and were so small that they were kind of fluctuating between the active years and not active years. And a lot of it was just kind of sort of a garage production and not a formal employment place. And then I just want to compare these 2 images of how the 1990s and 1980s are portrayed in this exhibition, but also in the popular memory forms. So the stalls from the open bazaars don't really show any people. It's just clothes, it's the architecture, and it's the goods that were available there. And we don't really learn who were the people that were buying their stuff, who were the people that were selling and producing the goods on this open air markets, and who actually were the small business owners that became such a social class almost in this era, versus the state socialism era, when the garment production was really organized around the very dominant working class that was able to organize itself into protests, such as this hunger demonstration that happened in July in 1981 as part of the Solidarity rise in Poland. So I think this shows that this perception of the public sector versus perception of the private sector during the end of the 20th century is very different. And we don't really talk about how the switch took place and how it was experienced by people that actually lived through it. There's no connection between these 2 groups, and we don't really learn about people that maybe did both and how they switched from this state socialist factories that actually bankrupted in a lot of cases, and how did they find themselves in this new era of the early capitalism and neoliberal Poland. So this relationship between the public and private sector, the consumption, the production, the workers, this is the topic of my thesis, and this is also something that I want to talk to you about today. And I just want to say that maybe it seems like something that something that is not so relevant today. I do hear, for example, I do read very interesting critiques of the post-socialist as a concept, as like, why do we still use the name of, to distinguish the region of post-socialist states by something that happened 30 years ago, and maybe it's no longer useful in describing the experiences of countries that are actually so diverse. But I do think that that it is still relevant to describe some of the experiences, and I do choose to use this word because it's still the legacy of the state socialism for the contemporary politics is actually still something that is present in contemporary debate. And just recently, in 2023 elections in Poland this October, actually the memory of the 1990s was mobilized in the part of the referendum that was introduced by the ruling party Law and Justice. In the referendum that was actually not binding in the end, and only 40% of people of registered voters took part in it. There were 4 questions. They actually had like a strong thesis in all of them, and maybe that's for a different debate. But it asked about the retirement age, it asked about the migrants, it asked about the relationship with European Union, but it also asked about the privatization of Polish assets, exactly the one that happened 30 years ago. So the question actually read, do you support the selling off of state assets to foreign entities, leading to the loss of Poles' control over strategic sectors of the economy? And in the news coverage of that question, exactly the archival footage of the 1990s of the politicians that were responsible for the privatization of state assets was used to kind of show that that this was not something that was done in a transparent way, and it led to the loss of Poles' control over strategic issues. So this idea that the 1990s memory is still important political issue is definitely still present in the collective and individual memory in the region. And in my research, I'm also, I just want to show the next slide. That is here. I feel that the book by Kirsten Gotzi and Mitchell Ornstein really nicely formulates the dominant narrative tropes of memory and the narrative tropes in debates about the transition. So they introduced these two tropes when speaking about the transition from communism to neoliberal democracies in the post-socialist regions. One that they call a J-curve perspective, which kind of acknowledges that there was some kind of social losses during the 1990s, but actually the long-term economic growth and gains in wealth, in GDP, and in life satisfactions that are usually quantitative data with statistics, for example, they show that this transition was a success, and that is something very prominent in a lot of memories and debates in Polish politics as well. And the opposite view shows transition as an utter catastrophe, and it points out to unemployment, to trauma, to the destructive labor market, to the destructive housing situations, poverty, substance abuse with rising alcoholism rates, for example, and the decreasing rates of fertility, life expectancy, and also to the corruption, criminality of chaos. So there's this really this picture that shows different, very often demographic data argues that the transition was a catastrophe, and even if it was a success, it was only for a narrow group of people in the top of the income distribution. And I'm not here to talk about which of them are true. It's just, and it's also not the main theme of the book. It's just to map out that these are the really dominant tropes of talking about this, about the 1990s and the and the social cost of them. And what I'm really interested in is how on the ground people in their biographical experiences in everyday life, how they understand that and how they talk about that. So something that is mostly connected to vernacular memory, which is obviously connected to the official memory, historical memory, or the dominant memory of the nation, but it doesn't translate. It's not internalized fully, never, and it's the relationship between our own understanding of the historical processes is not straightforward. Okay, so my case study is set in Głown, as it was already introduced, and it's centered around the single industry of bra production, of underwear production. So Głown has been called the Polish capital of bras, and it was also visited by the New York Times journalist looking for the best bras in the world. And this history of the industry starts in the 1948, as it was already mentioned, when the workers' cooperative was created. And it started as a small cooperative that was initiated by 25 women and 1 man. And it still exists until today and hasn't been privatized. But during the 70 years, the industry has definitely changed, and it was experienced a lot of transitions and kind of moved more from this cottage industry when workers were united under the cooperative, but actually each of them were producing at home with their own sewing machines, through the socialist big factory shop floor that still operates, but it doesn't hire as many people as it did in the 70s and 80s. And now it's also battling with the rise of the global sweatshops as the production in Poland is no longer profitable. So just to briefly say, the cooperative was created in the 48 and in the 60s, and from the 60s and late 80s, it hired 2,000 employees. It had several. It had its headquarters in Głown, but it had several production sites. And then in the 1990s, while the cooperative signed a deal with a German client, Triumph International, for outsourcing deal that ended in 2015, so it lasted 25 years. So the cooperative was kind of specializing in this production for a singular client. At the same time, the private sector, since the introduction of capitalism, was growing. And it's also very hard to say exactly what were the numbers and how many private workshops were operating in Głown at any point. There is this very prominent narrative trope when everybody says that it was there was a workshop on every street, which is obviously just like an exaggeration, but that's the story, that's the myth of the Głown industry. Here, just a number that I have seen proposed was that there were around 200 private sewing rooms in the 1990s in the town that has 15,000, the population of 15,000 inhabitants. And of course, these golden times are no longer here. There is a decline. And nowadays, there's definitely only a handful of these sewing rooms still in operation. And even if they exist in Głown, very often the company is registered here, but they're actually producing someplace else, also outside of Poland. So I wanted to focus on the single industry, exactly to trace how the resources from this public sector of the cooperative and the private sector of this private workshops are connected to each other, how this socialist legacy is interpreted in contemporary times, and whether it creates any tensions about how the privatization of these resources took place. Because we've seen that on this national level, it definitely is creating tensions. But in the small town, I wasn't sure if that's even going to be the case. And focusing on small town allowed me also to have a wide selection of producers that are very different from each other. So this is the table that shows the 21 oral history interviews that I took between August 2021 and October 2023. So it's 2 years time period. While of course this is not the case that this is a very representative data, I really aim to gather as wide selection of people to speak to as possible. So this shows the different elements of these differences between the interviewees in terms of year of birth, gender, education, their profession, and something that I'm trying to characterize as class, although I'm the most unsure about, and their relationship to private and public sector. And of course, this is and the relationship towards the cooperative. Yeah. So just to quickly talk about this, I think it's very clear that the interviewees can be, the age is something that is a very important factor for talking about this population. There's the difference in ages. It's the oldest person was born in the 30s. The youngest person still working in the industry is younger than me. It's in their 20s, early 20s. And there are basically two major generations. One being the pre-war generation that grew up in the state socialism and worked their whole life, usually in one employment place, very often the cooperative. And the other generation of baby boomers, so people who came of age during state socialism, but they were still in adulthood and in their reproductive years during the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. So they were still active on the market, on the labor market during the transition. In terms of education, that's also an interesting factor. I was quite surprised that higher education is a very important factor in starting your own business. But of course, I also was trying to access experiences of the working class and the middle class and the higher up class. And in terms of the public and private sector, that's something that I found very interesting while looking for people who would like to talk to me. So basically, this is the data that shows the information about 21 people. And you can see that 16 individuals have worked in the public sector and 14 have worked in the private sector. So that already shows that there is a strong overlap of 9 people that worked in different sectors. So it's very common actually for people of all ages to move between different forms of employment during state socialism, but also during in the post-socialism. I mostly talked with seamstresses, but also with forewomen, mechanics, construction designers, accountants, wide set of office workers hired in the industry, and 2 of the directors of the cooperative. And also with 9 people that at some point owned a lingering production business, but also only 4 of them that still have this business open, and 5 of them that have done that in the past. Okay, so, and also, of course, as part of triangulation of data, that's something that I am also trying to achieve, to kind of mix the sources of the oral history interviews with the archival materials, with the press reports. But because there is no archive in Głown, it's actually quite hard to access any archival materials because they are usually in private hands, and so that is another struggle. So that was just 20 minutes about my PhD, and now I want to talk more specifically about the history of the Głown cooperative. So here are the founding papers. On the left, we can see the first General Assembly notes from 1949, And on the right, the list of all the women and one man who started the cooperative in the 40s. But there's actually no way of talking about the 1940s in Głown without kind of going into this historical background a little bit. And actually what was Głown and how come women organized themselves to start this sewing cooperative. So pre-war Głown was a Jewish town with population of over 50% of the population, over 50% of the population being Jewish. On one hand, it was already industrialized as it had a large cotton and brass rolling mill that was hiring almost 2,000 workers. So it was really an industrial center of the region. And at the same time, it was a holiday resort because it was exactly located not so far from the highly industrialized Łódź. And it's located around pine woods and in between 3 rivers. So it had this reputation for being a healthy place to spend your holidays or weekends. And this is just part of one of the leaflets that advertises Głown and its location to tourists. But then, of course, during the Second World War, Głown was invaded by Nazis, and Głown ghetto was established, and later in 1942 it was all destroyed, with the Jewish population transported first to Warsaw Ghetto, later to Auschwitz and Treblinka. And also the factory was destroyed, it was not producing anything during that period. And so this straight after war 1940s Głown was definitely a destroyed small town with a lot of new population coming in. And these women of Głown were definitely part of the reusing of this available post-war resources there. So at the one hand, they were using this is the house that they were first located in, a sort of summer house for this summer tourists coming from bigger towns. This is where the first cooperative location was taking place. And on the other hand, while the heavy industry was being renewed, it was mainly employing men. So the women of Głown were sort of, the narrative that they were using was that they were looking for a place to employ women, and that's why a sewing cooperative was a suitable solution. Because they had their own sewing machines, the cooperative did not have them at all. During one of the first general assemblies of the cooperative, while it was a very independent idea, it applied to be a part of the nationalist economy through the Central Union of Work Cooperatives and the Financial Center of Union Cooperatives. And through that, it became part of the state institutions. And while it brought some tensions, because the workforce was replaced after this change, and the main director was also replaced several times from the local woman to the state appointed men that were from outside of Głown. It also received a lot of resources, and in 1959 it was able to move itself to a freshly built factory building that had a proper factory shop floor. So the production moved from this cottage industry, where all workers were working at their homes and just bringing the final products to the cooperative, to the actually factory with 2 shifts and the labor organization of the socialist state. So here, this is just the organization schema of the cooperative. This is also an interesting topic about how cooperative in state socialism was different from the state-controlled, state-owned factory. So here we can see, for example, that there is a general assembly that is a meeting once a year, where all the cooperative members, and back then all workers could have been members of the cooperative, they chose the workers' council, and the Workers' Council was responsible for appointing the cooperative management. And the management had 3 positions. First of them was the director. Here it was the main accountant, and here it was also the technical director. So that is about the cooperative, and its production grew and changed from, in the 1950s, it was producing just 3 designs of brass and 3 designs of corsair bears. It's actually, its consumption declined and it's no longer produced at all. And it also became this kind of center for our cooperative production in Poland, a knowledge hub of some sort. So these are some of the pictures of from the 1960s of the social life of the workers, and with its director and the Worker Council. And here I also have pictures of what type of products they were producing. This is actually quite hard to establish what were the products before the 1970s, because the proper design tables were lost or were not archived. But the archive from the 1970s showed that the products that we were producing were quite modern, and part of this modernization was because of the outsourcing for the Western German brand called Felina. And this deal was organized through the socialist state, and part of the opening to the West in the 1970s that took place in the whole economy of Poland during that era. And it's really, there's really interesting research that shows that this proto-globalization of the 1970s is really connected to the transnational capitalism of the 1990s. But with the orders from Felina, the designs of the cooperative and the machinery and the work organization has changed. And for example, on the top picture, you can see the traditional brass that are kind of full cup, soft cup brass of different sorts that were definitely being produced also before. And this is also what the model is wearing on the right. This is the advertisement from the end of the 1960s. And below, there's a picture that shows more the newer designs that were introduced in the 1970s. With the prefabricated cup, which is not soft, and which is not it's not a full cup. It's either a balconette, that's the lower on the left, or it's a higher cut, which shows more cleavage. Okay, so this is the 1970s, and then based on that. Definitely in the 1980s, the company was approached by Triumph International, and it signed the deal in the 1990s that organizes production until 2015, as I said. Okay, and now I just want to go more into the actual details of these vernacular memories and oral histories of the workers of the industry that I've spoken to. And I want to focus mainly on the question of the continuity and disruption between this public sector and private sector and the 1989, whether it brought any changes or it didn't. And just to check how much time I have. Sorry. All right, 10 more minutes. So here I want to talk about 3 very successful business owners that opened very big businesses. 2 of them still exist. One of them is no longer operating, but it also hired a significant amount of workers. So Elżbieta was born in Głown to a working class family. She started her studies as biologist, but she met her husband and had her first child and decided to quit this educational path. She started working briefly for this local industrial factory, the heavy industry that I spoke about before. But then, together with her husband, they decided to open a small grocery shop in the 1980s. So they were already working in the private sector during state socialism. And then in 1992, they decided to open a corsetry workshop. At first it was small, but then by the end of the 1990s, it was hiring 130 workers from Głown, and it still has almost as many workers, and it still produces underwear. And its goods are rather high-end, especially compared to other Głown brands, with around 50 euros or more per bra. And they don't sell in these markets or open-air bazaars, but they have their own malls, shops in malls. While speaking to Elżbieta about this idea of starting a business, she was she underlined heavily that she didn't have the faintest idea about sewing or about the underwear industry. So she says that she has no sewing skills, no experience, no education in this direction, absolutely nothing. She was just very ambitious, she and her husband. So in the sense, she was not connected to a cooperative at all. Instead, she actually says that she not only didn't have any public resources that she could use, she says that the town and especially the government only produce obstacles to her success. And this is also the second quote of Elżbieta is from the website of her company, which I find very interesting. It says that despite the huge economic transformation that Poland went through in the 1990s, they started the Corsair workshop. And she kind of sees this continuity of mistreating the private sector during state socialism, in post-socialism, until today. So she reflects that they were actually being ridiculed for working in a private sector, that they were unfair, that they were probably scheming against the state. And Elżbieta says that she was very offended by that because she still sees that the town benefited from the business she ran. Because this is a modern factory, she built the road that leads to it, she employs so many people, and also she offered so many scholarships to students to teach how to become a worker in her factory, but she also offered scholarships just in schools, and she had a lot of charity on the side. And I find it very interesting because she doesn't differentiate between any changes of the government between different economic and political orders, as if during state socialism, 1990s and today, the governments had the same policies towards running a business with stuff like taxes or control of the production or the funds to support the small businesses. Or the violation of labor codes. So I think her voice is quite unique in the sense that she really remembers this as an utter catastrophe. And on the other hand, we have Milena. She's the owner of the second biggest company in Głown. She was also born in the region. She's slightly younger. She also has higher education. And she actually joined her husband and his mother, who started the company. So her mother-in-law worked in the cooperative her whole life. And then in the 1990s, 1992 to be exact, she decided to start her own business with her son that was then 18 years old. And they ran this very small workshop until Milena met her husband Radek, got married with him and joined this family business. And she says that when she describes her joining the family business as a series of revolutions because she had a very different idea on how to run this business. And here there's a quote where she says that she and her husband, they started to build a brand so that it wouldn't be a cellar or a basement type of production, but really a brand. Indicating that before, with her mother-in-law in charge, the company really was not developing as this capitalist modern brand, but rather as a workshop in the garage, just producing goods for this open bazaar's working class clientele. And she also ridicules the name of the company before. She says that it was random and not suitable for the international company. And here, when I also ask her about the 1990s, on one hand, she says that it was a dream come true, that it was a golden age, that she wished it could come back. On the other hand, she also has these rather dark memories She has this one anecdote about what she calls an adventure, when she traveled with her husband to a town that recently had major bankruptcy of the public company and major unemployment issue. And they were looking for people to hire, and as seamstresses, and 600 people showed up. And she sees that as a rather humorous circumstances when she was not prepared for that. That kind of shows the chaos and the difficult situation that the business owners were in this era, because they were not used to that, and they didn't know and that's what she says in this fragment of the interview, that she didn't know how to choose them. She didn't know what kind of questions to ask. She didn't know who were the good workers and who were not. And that was really an adventure. So she doesn't really see this tragic side of that. And Tomasz, I think he's an interesting case because he's one of few men that have run the lingerie production, and he doesn't do it anymore. I think the patriarchal kind of discourses around business owners are quite profound, in a way that when he learned that I am interviewing business owners in Głown, he specifically asked me if I've talked to Elżbieta husband and Milena husbands that are actually not running the businesses. It was the women that do, but he wouldn't even use their names as the owners. But anyway, he has a very unique perspective of the 1990s, because he actually notices that he actually mobilizes this utter catastrophe narrative that the 1990s, in the 1990s, the nation was deceived by the financial minister Leszek Balcerowicz, who was a common motherfucker, because he only benefited, his transition only benefited the group and the caste. But at the same time, he doesn't use what he's speaking about at all to talk about Głown. So it's only this national level of narrative. So here are just a few pictures of the adverts of the companies that I spoke to. And all I want to say here, maybe I need to be finishing soon, is that it's very clear that all of these business owners really want to see themselves as a fresh start, and they really show that they had no skills and no connection to the cooperative without underlining the role of the skilled of many resources that the cooperative was providing to them, such as skilled labor force, the designs of the brass themselves, the work culture, as well as the distribution lines. So this is something that I want to explore more in this chapter on memory, but this is basically all I wanted to talk to you today. Okay.
Thank you, Marta, for this very interesting lecture with beautiful pictures, and I think that I'm sure that it opened a lot of questions and maybe comparisons, and so I'm opening the floor for questions, comments. Nina,
Hi.
I was expecting that you will be the first.
Thank you very much, Marta. It's very, very interesting. And as we discussed before, I think this opens a huge collaboration may open. Yes, and but I don't know much about like the workers' cooperatives and how they work, so I did not understand it quite well. On one hand, I understood that they self-organized. That was self-organized? How did this idea evolve? Did you talk to these women also, who not maybe in 1949, but maybe later, and how this was changing? You said that it was their machines, but then they lived in that building. At first, I understood that they were like, because I know that here it was seasonal, so many other women would work in rural homes, but like from time to time when the factory needed more labor force, they produced goods for the factory, but it was more seasonal. How this, like the factory cooperative system, how this worked, I mean, there were many other like this kind of cooperatives in the same town and elsewhere. So like this is more about cooperative in the socialist spirit, and I also did not understand whether the cooperatives still exist now. Is there continuity with these cooperatives, like the same cooperatives still exist? And what exactly does it mean, private rooms? Is this like a semi-formal, it's a little gray area, or these are like businesses? Or it's people who work at home and it's part of like the gray or even the black market. And the numbers of people involved in is this the garment producing or the underwear garment producing, like if I understood it correctly, 100,000 reduced to 50,000, or I did not get the numbers right.
Of what, sorry?
Of people working in this industry sector. What was the difference working in a cooperative and working in a factory? I mean, how do they remember if we're talking about the socialist past? And yeah, my comment on I did not also understand this categorization, right? It's on class categorizations where you expressed your concerns yourself. Is this your categorizations or they identified with these categories? And maybe for now, this is a
For me, because it's a lot of questions, so maybe I respond right away,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Thank you so much. All right. So starting from your first question about self-organization. So obviously, since it was the 49, none of the people that started the company, the cooperative, are alive. So it's impossible to talk to them. And I think it's also important to say that this history of like who was that, when was it, is not something that is well known. So when I first came to the cooperative, that still operates until today, it is still a cooperative. It hires now 60 people, so it's very small. So when I first entered it, no one kind of knew anything about that, and they were very interested in it, and they even had some misconceptions about it. So, for example, the current director told me that that the cooperative was started by Władza Bytomska, and that was the name of the cooperative, like the patron. And Władza Bytomska actually died in 30s, and her name was just like used, and it was introduced in the 50s, but she had nothing to do with the cooperative at all. So the founding mothers of the cooperative are not known at all, but that I would say is changing. Also just maybe because I asked these questions and then they were actually like, yeah, and we didn't have this talk, but just recently when I entered again, they were like talking more about that. Of how they now know that it was Victoria Baraniak. That was the name of the first director. So that is a question about self-organization and talking to them. So it's hard to say what was the idea. The narrative is that it was that they were looking for industrialization of female workforce because there was already industrialization of male workforce in heavy industry. The division between urban and rural, it's very similar to what you were saying, that I think that it was the case that they were seasonal workers, not among these 25 women, but later when it was already hiring like hundreds of people. That is quite something hard for me to fully understand because Głown in itself, it's not an industrial town, it's 15,000 inhabitants, so it's rather small. But it has a rural area around it, and these rural workers, they were actually working as cottage industry workers. So they stayed outside of Głown, they had their own sewing machines, and this continued until the 1990s, but they were producing their own brass. They were much less effective, it was very kind of not economical for the company, for the cooperative to keep on hiring them. But they were well organized and a part of the working class. So even when they were trying to fire them, there was a lot of pushback against that. So rural women were part of the workforce, but not on the shop floor. Other cooperatives, that is a good question. So from what I understood, there were 17 underwear cooperatives in Poland, but the one in Głown was the biggest. And something that I really am trying to understand is like why underwear production was organized as cooperative labor organization. Because you didn't have to know. It could have been a nationalized state factory, but somehow it didn't. So this is something yet that I don't really know who I can ask this question to. I'm looking for it in the sources, not really. Now it's the only still running cooperative in Poland. So it still exists and there is a continuation, and it's definitely due to this Triumph deal. Ever since Triumph pulled out, that was 8 years ago, they are in a lot of crisis. They are not hiring new people, they don't have many orders, but they are still getting by. So they are not completely closing down. So that is very much the narrative of decline, of like ruins, of how everything is going to getting worse in the town. That's definitely something that a lot of people speak about. And a lot of people in the town don't even know that the cooperative is still a cooperative. They are like, oh, it's definitely closed down, or like, oh, it's privatized. And I'm like, well, no, look, this is a cooperative, it's still running. They're like, I don't believe you. So that's a surprising element, because there aren't many cooperatives. The private sector and the black market, I would definitely, that it was both businesses that were formally paying the taxes and like legalized, registered, and the ones that were not. This is also difficult about speaking. This is an issue about that I face when I'm speaking with people that run these businesses. When I'm like, okay, so when did you open your business? And they don't really want to tell me. It's like maybe it was then, but then maybe it was not registered back then. Oh, actually registered it last year. And I'm like, well, it definitely was opened before. I'm not gonna snitch, but I do understand that they don't want to share that. And definitely in terms of numbers of like how many people were employed, that's also very difficult to establish because the private sector didn't have archives, right? And there's no statistics center that would gather this information about 90s. So I only have like data until of the cooperative that continues to share this data, but the private sector, it's very hard to say. And what is the difference between working at the cooperative versus working in a private company? I feel like I'm talking so much, but basically, I think it's fascinating. I was very curious about that. One thing is that a lot of seamstresses were working at both places, so they would have one morning shift at the cooperative, and then that would cover the social security, that would cover this basic salary, because it was lower than in the private sector, and then they would go to do another shift at the private sector, which allowed them to earn much more, at which they had to be much more. They were controlled and they were probably shouted that it wasn't always the best atmosphere of the socialization as in the shop floor, but the money was so good that they would prioritize this work. And often they would later, come very tired to the morning shift when they didn't have to be so productive because they would still get paid something. And then kind of this logic of like where to put your effort to have the best results was switching in the 1990s.
This was in the 90s.
Yes.
You were seeing.
Yeah. Because now, it's just 60 people that work in the cooperative, so it's not that many of them. Yeah. Was there something I missed?
This is what they were like together in the same building, and what was the game? I mean, what did it mean to work in cooperatives in socialist times? I mean, did they have much more to say, a decisive role? What was the role?
That is a very good question. So there, for example, in so like academic papers about socialist cooperatives are very critical about them. They are basically like, that wasn't really a cooperative. Cooperatives were pre-war when they were when it was voluntary, and when it was smaller, and the workers didn't have to have representatives that would represent them in the General Assembly, because all of the workers would come. So there is this very negative view about, in general, the cooperatives during the socialist state in academia. But I do think that it could be more nuanced, because at the same time it wasn't like the factory, in the sense that they still had this workers' council. And for example, the cottage industry workers were not hired exactly because they were coming to general assemblies and they were fighting their case. So even when they tried, there was some pushback from, even when the management tried. But at the same time, a lot of things are similar. And for example, these pictures of like this idea that there's a patriarchal socialist factory, right? The one that kind of shares a lot of that you just share a lot of life in your workplace, because it's your socialization. It cares about your reproductive rights in terms of like canteen, the small hospital there, the fact that you can apply for a loan to get your apartment built, the fact that your children were traveling with other children to some camps. You could go to a camp with your family. So whenever I speak to workers, they're very nostalgic about this era, and I think this is a very similar case to other people that I've read who did oral history with factory workers just during socialist times. So it's kind of hard to find the actual differences. The biggest ones would be like really the people who see them were the ones that were actually workers, activists. So they were themselves in the management or in the workers' council. Then they would say, "Oh, it's totally different. We had so much power." But then the people that didn't take part in it, they are more skeptical about this, and they would say, "Oh, it was actually just as a factory." So it really depends who's speaking about that.
It would be interesting to compare this organization with the self-management factory, which is not a cooperative. But also in Yugoslavia there were cooperatives, especially in in farmer sector.
Sorry?
In the sector of agriculture, and
It's very different.
it's a very different cooperative kind of idea behind it, I suppose. So, were there any cooperatives in textile industries? Nina,
No, I don't even know that there were like cooperatives in industry. I don't know Zarko. Zarko's not here.
There were.
They were. I
In
mean,
industry, cooperatives.
cooperatives, but they were smaller. It was mostly in the late 40s, I think. I know from my local few villages, there was the, how do you say, the shoemaker cooperative.
Oh yeah, but this was in transition from the crafts up to industry.
Up
So
to industry, yeah. And it failed, mostly failed, or changed into...
But that's how the craft was transitioning towards industry, and it was a transitional period. So
it was not an idea
it was not. It was like here, the factories, the industry they were self-managed.
And would it be similar to this, that there is a council, the General Assembly, in terms of self-management, or not at all?
But there was a
You
workers'
have workers and
council,
yeah,
there were
workers.
representatives of workers. But there was, huge number of people, an assembly line, much work and much attention was paid how to create a factory community. And I don't know whether here it was the same, because it was the focus was on collective, on factory collective. And here, I don't know, it's individuals.
And in
is it?
Yugoslavia, the factories has a special role with the housing, for example, and the free time.
I have data here from Chiara Bonfiglioli, who did research on Macedonian factories in towns of Štip and Kočani, which are also now popular post, this is like Štip in also Yugoslav, but post-Yugoslav times, and how it deteriorated. And she put very interesting information about how Tibor Štip had a healthcare institution, just like you said, and a restaurant, so it's very comparable. Daycare center for children. Also, the health institution had gynecological treatment, counseling for use of contraceptives, a laboratory, pediatrician, and dentist unit, and they also built houses for the workers. Fast forward after 90s and privatization and stuff, that is familiar for all. There was very good data about, I'm going to make it short, about how actually they started producing for the European market under the label Made in Europe. So not EU, but Made in Europe. There are very many reported cases of worker exploitation, working for 4 to 5 euro per day for more than 13 hours. Also cases of death at work, and only after they started organizing through some grassroots NGOs. So I was actually curious about this mistreatment, maltreatment of workers. If there is anything you encountered that is similar.
I read this work as well, and I was very impressed with also the strikes, the organization against this exploitation. So I knew that this was not happening in Głown at any point, but I still was so sure that this exploitation had to have taken place, and I just have to find someone who will tell me about this. But right now I'm wondering if I may be wrong, in the sense that I've talked to seamstresses and I've talked to business owners, and then I've also talked to local labor inspector who worked there during socialism and in post-socialism. And there's just not one case. And I don't know. It makes me wonder, maybe just because it was Głown, maybe it's because it's a small town, the scale was different. In Łódź, which had this gigantic, it's a population of 300,000, and had this majority of people employed in this textile industry, that big factories that then bankrupted, and kind of underground, a lot of small workshops opened. And then about Łódź, you can find this articles in press about this workers' rights violation, and about exploitation, about violence and threats. And I don't know if this is just not reported, or it's not talked about, or it didn't happen. I don't know. I don't know. If you have any ideas how to better access it, I would love to hear more.
I have a slightly more current question, series, I guess, questions. But yeah. And maybe some of the women in this place are wondering similar things. So the article in New York Times was from 2019.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, in the current era, you have a mixture of companies still as a part of the cooperative, and some that are out of the cooperative, right?
There's a cooperative that hires 60 people, and there are a few
other companies.
Yes.
So were they talking about the brass from the cooperative?
No.
Or one of the
modern? They only talk to the private owners.
And
that is also, that has been not in interviews that I took, so I don't have it on tape, but people are noticing that. They're like, yeah, of course they went to this ones. Like, and the company that has been open for 70 years, oh, they forgot. And they are mad at it. There's a lack of recognition, right? Yeah. But to be honest, yeah, I mean, this article, you can imagine how it is.
Are those private companies now turned to be some kind of producing small-scale elite products? That they are more trying to be branded as something special, or maybe as this cooperative has this kind of socialist, post-socialist reputation, or is this kind of in discourse level?
On discourse level. I think it could be, but at the same time, the cooperative was producing for Triumph International for 25 years. This is such a source of pride for all of them, that this is the best, this is a Mercedes of brass, this is the best brass of the world. And I think it's also because Triumph was present during state socialism on the market. You could buy it for hard currency in Warsaw. So the fact that they knew this as a luxury brand that's very old, and then in the 1990s it came to Głown and started producing, this is very important. But at the same time, even if you have exact design of the bra, of the Triumph International bra, and even if you have skilled workforce that literally is producing this brass, you cannot still, it's very hard to actually produce something that is identical in terms of quality, or it would be very expensive because Triumph International has this economies of scale and the distribution. So it's not easily duplicable. So the cooperative kind of now produces. Oh, I do remember because I am from Głown, and my parents, my mom would never buy a bra from anywhere else than the cooperative because she says it's the same as Triumph but for 1/3 of the price, right? Like, of course it is. It's the same people that produced it. And the private businesses, they have I think this is like the biggest turn in general in bra productions, that is this bra fitting as a concept, that is and as a service. So they are producing bras for a high variety of sizes, and that is a big change because so right now we could produce up to 100 sizes of bras. And for example, during state socialism, it would be 10 sizes. So that's a big change, and this small business owners are really catering to these needs of higher range of, and of course they're also more expensive because they are selling their products in different for a different target audience.
Yeah, maybe I missed this in the end because I went to coffee, but. How do they sell it? I think they stopped their cooperation with Triumph in 2015, right?
Yes.
And who are they producing for now?
Yeah. Well, they definitely struggle a lot. So they have their own brand. So they are focusing on that now. But then there's also a lot of criticism that when Triumph was there, they should have not forgotten about their own brand. And the brand has, it's not really visible, but there's a logo of it. It's, it's GG, so it's like Głown, and it's also corsetry, so korseciarstwo. So this is a brand that still exists, and it existed, since the socialist times. They modernized it heavily. In the 1990s, they were not producing as much, and now they are trying to kind of place it on the map of the products, of the brands in Poland, but definitely it's hard. And another thing that they do is that they can still subcontract for international or local brands even. So yeah, there's some nodding. So of course there's a lot of bigger and smaller brands that still sometimes will have some orders, but they are not so big and they are not so consistent. So it's very precarious. So they have an order and it has a strict deadline, and then after this, maybe there's not going to be a next one. So that's very stressful. And they are thinking about privatizing. because apparently, especially during COVID or after COVID, there's a lot of funds that the state and the municipality is providing for private businesses. So you can apply for some kind of grant for modernization or for, I suppose mostly for modernization of machinery. Or for skills, so for seminars, for workshops, for workers on different. And if you're a cooperative, apparently a lot of it is not accessible. So they are now thinking about privatization, even though it's very hard, because it would, and after so many years when they did survive, but yeah.
Question?
Just maybe you know, maybe you don't know, but I just remembered to understand better the geopolitics behind it. Where does the cotton come from? Did they say?
Oh, I love that. No, I don't know where is the cotton coming
But
from.
it's not only cotton, it's fabric, right? Because it's spinned and woven somewhere else because the fabric comes.
Yeah, no, that's true. So the fabric comes from wood. That's basically why.
From what?
Why the
So there's still spinning and weaving industry.
No. Now there is it probably is very much in decline. But for probably until the 90s, it was a safe place to place orders, and it was closed. So yeah, I never. But then where is it coming from to wood? I'm not sure. I definitely am noting that.
I'm sorry, I have on this private business that the majority of them have their own productions. They are not working with home-based workers because what you were saying, like what Chiara was conducting research on in the contemporary times, is also very much it's a huge problem in Macedonia because there are so many of home-based production. Workers do not know each other. They cannot form a collective, and of course, it's very hard, like to protest and to like fight for I don't know bigger wages and other kinds of protection. How is it here? Is there productions and they work their assembly lines in one spot, or it's diverse?
It's definitely diverse. So the two business owners I spoke to, they own the biggest factories, and they employ above 100 of workers, and they have assembly lines, they have factory buildings, and then over the years there were definitely other factories that were also not happening in cellar or basement, so they had their buildings that are abandoned, for example. But then definitely a lot of these 200 factories that were operating in 1990s were happening in someone's apartments, and they were very small companies, so they were hiring around 10 people, and that's working on 2 shifts. So on one shift for 5 people working, that would be the norm, and then it's definitely very hard to have any leverage. There was another question.
Any other question?
Mundane, but when we were talking about where the fabric is coming from, and I was listening to you before when you said that you could buy a Triumph bra for a third of the price without the name tag on. Because I remember that during our socialist era, many of the Western fashion producers were working, had subcontractors in Yugoslavia, Slovenia especially.
Yeah, Lohnarbeit, yeah.
Yeah, Lohnarbeit. And usually the Lohnarbeit meant also that they provided the fabric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is this, in this case, was the fabric actually Polish in the 80s, or was the fabric coming from the manufacturer, I mean, from the brand owner?
Yeah, I don't fully know. That's a good question. How it was called? Because about Felina, so this deal in the 70s, it's very little information. There's basically almost nothing in the archives, and most people don't remember it. A lot of people say that I made it up. So that's very, these questions, then it's very hard to answer. But for Triumph, that's probably is possible to check it, and I definitely in the 90s, yeah.
Already in the 80s, you said that they started to work for the NBA.
They were approached in the 80s, and they were negotiating the deal, and it took years actually, with like a lot of trips and a lot of like pilot production of just like, because and it takes a lot about discipline and efficiency and just like perfectionism of the product. So apparently Triumph approached a lot of companies in Poland, and then it only have chosen 2 that were like meeting its standards. So that only hypes up this idea that this is the best bra in the world because it's so hard to produce. Yeah, but it's also about this changes of the sustainability of workers, because I feel that that it changes when you are producing something that is expensive and so perfected and Western versus whether you're producing for a domestic brand, something that has very bad reputation. The socialist brands from Poland, they have, just like any socialist goods, there is this exaggerated narrative about how socialist has the worst goods, right? And how
that was another question, I'm sorry, but we still have, not in Slovenia, I think the product, the Beti and so on, are
The Lisa.
Lisa is still alive, yes, quite strong, but there are also other brands that are on one hand very socialist in our minds, and on the other hand, they still have this nostalgia moment, and they're still selling and producing. Kind of, whenever I see Galem underwear, I ask myself whether, and then I buy something. not that particular socialist model that still exists there, but is there
Not that nostalgic.
not that nostalgic? Yes. Is there
underwear,
still this nostalgic
It's also underwear.
moment?
It's also underwear and the
You can
Underwear.
your granddad's
Especially-
editions.
especially men's underwear.
Man's underwear, yeah.
It's Croatian firm from Dalmatia.
I see, that's fascinating.
But is there any nostalgia over those products?
Well, I would say that not really, but something that is happening is that there is more criticism towards this 1990s products. So there is some kind of
Criticism towards the products.
yeah, and
Not
advertising.
businesses.
Yes. So for example, when I was speaking to the business owners of these companies and this adverts, they are all ashamed. They are like, oh my God, what were we producing? That is because it's very sexualized, because it's very, yeah, I mean, it has a certain style that is maybe not in style right now, that's how fashion changes, right?
It was normal.
So in a lot of instances here, it's just white underwear, but there's like catalogs in late 90s and early 2000s was just like so many patterns, so many gimmicks, so many weird, materials with like Swarovski diamonds or with leopard print. This like over the top design. Which I don't have anything against, but when they are showing me that, they're like, oh my God, that is so kitsch, right? That is so too much. We would never produce anything like that. So there's criticism of that. I personally, I think that I'm nostalgic for these bras. I think that they are very beautiful and yeah, but I don't think it's like a consumerist movement. Yeah. But this bra, I don't know, that's also something about the sexualization. This ad of Triumph from 2000 in German, it says, from now on, the lights stay on. And it was like this whole series of slogans about underwear that were very sexualized, to the point that there were complaints from feminists or from religious organizations against such use of words and positions and lightning that would show the sexual context too much.
Okay. Are there any questions? More? So then it would be nice then to conclude slowly with this idea of the best bra in the world, either socialist or post-socialist or post-post-socialist or neo-capitalist or whatever. It's the matter of taste. And thank you, Marta. It was very interesting, and it was very. I've learned a lot about bras. And I will seize the opportunity at the end, not just to invite all the people who are actually physically here to have a coffee, because they can smell it, which is the best thing if you're here, because you can have a coffee, and of course we deliberately bring the coffee before the end of the lecture, that the people can get more energy to ask questions, and brings up the atmosphere. But I will seize the moment to announce the third lecture. It will happen the next month, the 13th of December. And Tamara Scheer, Austrian researcher of Habsburg monarchy and Habsburg army especially, and linguistics, will hold a lecture entitled Representation and Marginalization, Language Diversity in the Austro-Hungarian Army from 1867 to 1918. And this will happen, I repeat, the 13th of December. I don't know if it's going to be Friday or not, but anyway, you are welcome to join in or come here to have a coffee and conversation. Thank you for today, and let's have a coffee. Bye.